Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you all. My name is again Ryan Lentz. I'm one of the organizers and facilitators at Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training, and it's wonderful to be here with you all. So our plenary for this afternoon is called Beyond Good, and reimagining faithfulness in the pursuit of justice. And in her sermon, Jessica did a masterful job of kind of setting the scene for the conversation that we're hoping that we'll be able to bring to you today. If you could move to the second slide, you might have seen a little bit of a background in terms of how we approached this session. So we started kind of with the question of did we feel like sometimes the question of seeking goodness and seeking faithfulness gets confused? That's where we kind of started from designing this session. And so we wanted to spend some time in this plenary delving into how that confusion may be shaping and misshaping our approach to crucial questions of community, embracing the gift of God's diversity, and the work of justice. And so we're hoping that in our time together, that we'll grapple with the relationship between goodness and faithfulness. How are those things interconnected? How are they distinct from one another? And how can we get caught up in narratives and motivations that often confuse those? And then also to think a little bit about, like, what are some foundations? What are some roots that we can draw on? What are perspectives and narratives that we can lean into that can breathe new life and inspire our work for justice together? So that's what we're hoping to do together. I think we want to dive right into the getting some feedback from you all. And so we're going to use a tool called a Mentimeter. And so the next slide here is going to show a QR code. And we're going to, and actually, can you go back to the QR code that's on the next slide there? If you could pull out your phone and use your camera app to scan that, it's going to take you to a website called mentimeter.com. And when you get there, you're going to see a question and a couple of slots to put in either a word or a phrase. And I believe the way that the prompt is worded is, when you think of seeking goodness, when we think about our motivation to seek goodness, what's a word or phrase or a couple of words that come to mind when you think about that? What are motivations? What are things that underlie that? Take a moment to just think about that and put in a couple of responses. And you can actually fill this out as many times as you want. And we'll keep the QR code up for just a couple more seconds so that folks can scan that. And then we'll move over to the website. And what that will do is, in real time, it's going to generate a word cloud based on your responses. So we'll see what comes up. Okay, I don't see anybody else. Actually, does anybody else need help with scanning the QR code? See, a couple more people are looking at it.
Ryan,
yes.
This is Jody upstairs. I'm letting it up just a little bit longer so our Zoom folks can connect.
Great. And I think when we shift over to the Mentimeter, it'll also show a way that you can type in a URL as well. So, but thanks for that, Jody. Okay, whenever you all are ready, if we can move over to the Mentimeter page, I think that should be showing some results. Okay, so you can see this is generating in real time as you all press the button. So just take a moment to kind of notice what's coming up here on this slide as it comes together. I'm certainly seeing, I think, a lot of things that we think of that are also connected to faithfulness, right? You know, certainly love, kindness, peace, justice. But we also can see some ways that seeking goodness can sometimes get co-opted. Like I'm seeing a couple of words like, like savior complex and vanity and what else are you seeing, Jessica? It's a lot. Things are moving around quickly.
Egocentrism, safety.
Mm-hmm.
There's a sense of like righteousness from my own.
Yeah.
Following the law.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's something about, you know, putting conditions sometimes on that, like rule following.
Yeah, not messing up.
Yeah. Great. So why don't we shift to the second question? So if you click to the next one, you'll see the next question in the Mentimeter. If you keep the same thing open, you'll see this question of seeking faithfulness. So seeking faithfulness, what comes to mind? And so just take a few moments to notice how this one is both similar and different. What are some of the same words, phrases that are showing up here, but also what perhaps is a little bit different? How might we distinguish those two?
One of the immediate noticeable things is that in the last one, the word parts of there. Are you familiar with our word clouds word? Right. So in the last one, the word driving is kindness, and this one, the word driving is love. Now it's possible you were influenced by a sermon about this, right? Like I'm not gonna pretend that you were like, I know the answer here is love. But certainly you see different sort of love and commitment and justice and following Jesus have play a larger role when the question is faithfulness. You're not seeing words like safety here.
Yeah.
There's a lot more words about trusting Jesus, taking up the cross. Words like studying the word, identity,
perseverance.
There's
devotion.
A fundamental different quality to this than when the aim is goodness.
Yeah.
I think the question is, why does this matter?
Yeah.
And Ryan, why does this matter?
So I think this is maybe where we would bring in a conversation partner to this that comes to us. There's a book that we will reference a little bit this afternoon called The Person You Mean to Be. And this is by Dr. Dolly Chugh, who is a psychologist who studies and teaches at the NYU Stern School of Business. If you could switch back over to the slide deck.
Show, that would be great.
Yeah. And one of the things that she talks about in her work and in this book is that she studies the psychology of good people. If you go to the next slide here.
There we go.
And so she actually has written two books. This one here that came out in 2018, The Person You Mean to Be, How Good People Fight Bias. And then her more recent title is called A More Just Future, Psychological Tools for Reckoning with Our Past and Driving Social Change. And so she uses this language of the psychology of good people. And one of the things she talks about is that by and large, most of us are invested in being seen as good people. There's very few of us that are either completely indifferent to the idea of how we're perceived or just say that that isn't a value to them. And what she talks about is that this investment in being seen as good is connected to a term in psychology that has to do with bounded ethicality or bounded rationality. And she connects this idea that bounded rationality is that we can't know everything, right? Like our ability to understand the world and the relationship between systems is limited by our knowledge. That's pretty intuitive, right? And the same thing is kind of connected to this idea of bounded ethicality. Yeah.
And if you go one more slide,
Yeah.
we have a little bit about the business of bounded ethicality. And I think that, one example, let me just give you an example of bounded ethicality. When we were driving this morning here, one of my favorite parts of the book is just describing herself participating in a die-in, right? She's at
protest,
Target.
yeah.
This is, they're doing an action with a community group. She's on the floor at Target trying to call attention to police violence, but she's also mentally shopping, right? She's sitting at Target in the floor while thinking, well, when the dying ends, I should go ahead and pick up the following items, right? And she's not connecting that she does not kind of processing the disconnect between the fact that she's there to call attention to something that's serious and significant, and the fact that she's actively in her head disconnected from the very action and just doing shopping for her child. And so that there is like this place that she talks about that even if we were to be and desire to be good people, none of us can really be that good all of the time.
Yeah.
That we just don't have that capacity in us.
Yeah. And that oftentimes, because we have this investment in being seen as good, that it actually kind of creates a binary sometimes in our mind, right? That if we have a narrative in our mind that says that we are good, and then we are presented with feedback or a situation that suggests otherwise, that what often we do is we can discard that. If we have this idea of being invested in being good, and it's like we just want to deny that or kind of push that away, and it can create this kind of all or nothing thing that when either we reject it altogether or it becomes this thing of like, oh, I'm a bad person, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you can go to the next slide there, the argument that she makes around this is that one that I think when we're not thinking about ourselves is like, none of us can be good all of the time, right? And that we often don't recognize the way that bias does shape our experiences, that we all have a series of experiences and stimuli that kind of shape our understanding of the world. And it's impossible for us in any given moment to be fully consciously aware of the ways that those biases and help shape and interpret how we see a situation, how we make decisions in various different situations. And so the next slide here has a really powerful quote that she brought in, I think, in a TED Talk that some of you might have seen. And I'm wondering if we could bring up that next slide here.
Well, we wait for that slide. I think that one of the pieces about this business of don't recognize the role that bias plays. And I would say that it's also not recognizing the role that conditioning plays, right? Yeah. That the bias as a conditioned behavior is even if I'm not having a biased experience, I am still having a conditioned response. So I'm sitting in the bottom of a store. My conditioning while being in a store is to be a consumer. So I am consuming even if I'm there to disrupt something. Another idea that she talks about is this notion, and this is connected to this piece, is the ways that she describes it as ordinary privileges, that part of what gets activated in unconscious ways is like the expectations that we have that produce biases even when we're not thinking about it. For example, that I am fully able-bodied and I can walk around the world and think about the full use of my body, which then makes me really biased relative to like the kinds of exercises I do, the kinds of language I use, the kinds of references I make. I'm not trying to be biased against people who don't have full use of their body, but I am not thinking about it at all. I am just a good person moving around doing good things in the world. And yet I am behaving in ways that actually perpetuate boundaries and barriers for other people. And so that sense of being bounded, not being able to notice or see or apprehend what I'm doing.
Yeah. And so, I think in the book, she gives a couple of examples. Like if you see on a piece of paper, peanut butter and blank, how would you fill that in? Jelly, right? If I said Jack and blank, right? So again, like how in our culture we get a million of these shortcuts that we just live in our brains that oftentimes we're not even fully consciously aware of. And so she brings in a little bit of social science to this. You know, she says that the brain is relying on a bunch of shortcuts to do a lot of the work that we do that just helps us to get from one space to the next, meaning that there are a lot of mental processes that are taking place outside of our awareness in kind of that low battery mode within low power mode in the back of our mind. And that some scientists estimate that at any given point, this quote just blew my mind when I heard this, that we are capable of processing up to 11 million pieces of data at any given moment. And only 40 of those bits of data are consciously processed, right? So just think of just the sheer proportion of what is going on in background, right? Really, I think kind of underlines this idea of how difficult it is oftentimes to kind of free ourselves from the biases that we're conditioned into.
Yeah, one example of this is think about your drive home. How often do you consciously think about your drive home? Consciously, actually paying attention to every single step you are taking along the way. And how often did you get home and you go, I have no idea.
I have no recollection.
I have no idea what happened on the way here. I was listening to a podcast while looking at the road, while driving a car, while talking on the phone. I have no idea what happened on the way here. My body knew how to get here. So that is the capacity that we have of our brain to process information, but it doesn't mean that we are in any way aware or cognizant or conscious of it.
Yeah.
And that is in fact where I think bias then comes in.
Yeah. So again, I think when we think about, especially in the church, where we are in the business of morality and about being people who are good and faithful, it speaks to like how do we build some disciplines and some practices that can help us to think a little bit more critically, as opposed to just kind of seeking that sometimes that easier and I would say more superficial level of goodness that we're often wired towards and have a predisposition towards. How do we think about a more radical, rooted, faithful journey that moves us towards greater fidelity?
I think, one of the things that I think we've learned at Crossroads, and if you've never heard of us, so we've been around for 40 years, and we said to the earlier group this morning that we started as a church project, right? We started helping church people who were really committed to being diverse communities, right? This is the mid-1980s. They're trying to figure out, how do we diversify our bodies? How do we welcome new people? How do we extend the work outside of the walls of the church, right? That's where we come into the world. And the question that over and over people were confronted with when we would go and do workshops with folks in churches and church basements is we would get to the conversations around race or racism or sexism or classism, you name the ism. The minute that the conversation turned to the question of what about us? What about our biases? Everybody went, and she uses the word, we went into red warning, red light, danger, danger, danger zone. What do you mean us? I thought we were here to talk about them. I thought that we don't need this. We are not the problem. They are the problem. We don't need to be in this workshop. They need to be in this workshop. And there is this, what we discover over time, the more we work with people, is that the folks that we were encountering weren't particularly, as Ryan says, were lacking a deep root. And part of what was preventing the deep rootedness was the sense of, well, we already are good people. Like, I don't know why you are calling into question our goodness. And I think that there's two things we would say, that part of the rootedness that we need to cultivate is, one is to say, what is the goodness that we are debating and what is the goodness we are not debating? And one goodness we are not debating is the inherent goodness that comes to us through God, who loves us and created us and made us be good. And so when we say moving beyond good here, we're not talking about questioning anyone's goodness. What we are talking about is, what does it mean to move beyond performances of goodness that are often shallow and don't open us up for critique? How do we go deeper than just a desiring to do the right thing, to actually be people who are living out a goodness that we have received, that there's something deeper here for us to explore. But among Christians, this question of good versus faithful has proven to be a very powerful, sticky point.
Yeah. So as we kind of shift from kind of that initial framing of good and faithful, we want to think a little bit about what, as people of faith, what roots our efforts for justice? Like, what are some of those foundational understandings? So if you could flip to the next two slides ahead, that would be helpful.
Yeah.
And so one is one that I think we've already surfaced a little bit, right? That God's very first blessing to us as a human family, as a planetary family, is that of diversity, right? When we read the story of Genesis and as we hear the creation story, as we come to the conclusion of making human beings in our likeness, that everything is blessed as very good, right? As being fundamentally a gift from God, right? And so if we understand that gift of diversity coming from God and being a primary blessing and gift, that one of the freedoms that, as you said in your sermon, Jessica, is a freedom to defend that, to preserve that, to always act in ways that is in harmony with that understanding at a planetary level, at a societal level, at a communal, institutional level, and an individual familial level.
And I think that part of that, I was telling the group this morning that I became a Presbyterian because we write things down. And one of the beauties of writing things down is that we have a testament to the things we have said throughout time, right? And that's really important. And so I believe that the next slide, has the opening words of our Facing Racism official policy. And you've never read this, go to the PCUSA website, look up Facing Race, a vision for the intercultural community, church-wide anti-racism policy, passed in 2016, in which the opening of that document reads, "The Bible insistently reveals that God loves diversity and justice. This is seen in the wide variety of creation in which God delights." We affirmed that as a community, right? We said collectively, we need to be grounded. We need to defend and protect. I think the other thing that what drove me to be a Presbyterian, if we go one more forward, is that along with defending and standing up and valuing what God has made good, what God has created and declared good, is that the affirmation, if we go one more slide, the affirmation that we are made in the image of God, that we are bearers of God's likeness. And because we are bearers of God's likeness, then part of the work is to protect human dignity. And so I think that at a time when we say lots of things about words like DEI, for example, and a very inadequate summary of what a whole body of work that is hundreds of, like at this point, 100 years old, if we go back to the writings of early suffragists and early people who were fighting for their dignity, we know that there is more to the work of saying we are now called to defend a series of letters. What we are really talking about, at least in Crossroads, and when we do our work as both an organization but as people of faith, what we're talking about is what does it mean to exist in a world where we can look at each other and see the likeness of the Creator and see the holiness and the sacredness of a living being in front of us and affirm that because it is good and because we affirm a creation that says it is good. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where we can look at places like the Confession of 67, which I already referenced. And if you've never read the Confession of 67, I encourage you to do it. Let me just say, it's a problematic confession, right? It's not perfect by any means. And yet it has amazing language about the call to stand against structures that marginalize and diminish. Language like this: God has created the peoples of the earth to be one universal family. In this reconciling love, God overcomes the barriers between sisters and brothers and breaks down every form of discrimination based on racial or ethnic difference, real or imaginary. We wrote that in 1967.
you could put the next slide up, that shows that quote there. We can get it together.
So I want us to think about the kind of community that we already claim ourselves to be. That when we're saying we are wanting to move beyond good, to be faithful, we've been in this journey. At least, what is 67? 50? No, more than 50.
Yeah, 57 years.
57 years. And a minimum
58,
for 57 years, we have been affirming this. So how do we continue to give breath and animate this? It's actually the invitation when we are doing something called anti-racism work.
Yeah. Yeah, I think for me, and this is speaking as the resident Catholic in the room, right? In terms of thinking about the tenets of Catholic social teaching, which for me are so meaningful, is that the linkage between Imago Dei, of recognizing the inherent dignity of each human being, is so intrinsically connected to the call to solidarity, right? That because we are siblings to one another, we ought to be in right relationship with one another, to understand how the ways in which parts of the human family suffer, that we all have a collective responsibility for that, and animating that in our practice. I think our next kind of foundational affirmation that we want to bring in, which is on the next slide here, really connects to what God has revealed in salvation history about God's concern for the poor, marginalized, and vulnerable. Again, using Catholic language, I think about the preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, right? That God makes it so abundantly clear, both in the Hebrew Bible and in the New Testament, about God's unique concern and priority for how those most in the margins of society are faring, right? Certainly in the Hebrew scriptures, around the concern for the Anawim, the foreigner, the orphan, the widow. That part of God's covenant, part of fidelity to God's covenant, is directly connected to how the Israelites are showing concern for those most marginalized members of society. And so I think, again, we have another quotation, and I believe this one is from the Confession of Belhar, that's on the next slide, that we can read in. So again, this is from 1986. That says, the Confession of Belhar says, God, in a world full of injustice and enmity, is in a special way the God of the destitute, the poor, and the wronged. That God calls the church to follow him in this. For God brings justice to the oppressed and gives bread to the hungry. That God frees the prisoner and restores sight to the blind. That God supports the downtrodden, protects the stranger, helps orphans and widows, and blocks the path of the ungodly. That for God, pure and undefiled religion is to visit the orphans and the widows in their suffering.
The committee that suggested that PCUSA adopt this confession was created in 2001, and it served from 2001 to 2004. And it was called the Task Force to Study Issues of Reparations. Now, and I'm mindful that sometimes we hear that word reparations and we go to that Dolly Shook, red flags, what does that mean? And we were having dinner last night, and I was asked the question, what is the role of forgiveness when we're talking about this work, the work of bringing about racial justice? What is the work of forgiveness there? And my answer to that question was that I believe that there is always room for forgiveness, but that we adhere to restorative justice practices that say that forgiveness without accountability, forgiveness without contending and confronting history, forgiveness without dealing with the multi-generational consequences of the choices that were made for us, that we continue to bear, that is not possible, that we have to do both. And this committee made that recommendation to us. They said, let's look to the Church of South Africa. Let's look at the ways that they have confessed something. Let's look at the ways that a confession came out of apartheid to make sense of the world, to try and push against the drive to forget and be certainly good people in relationship with each other, but to be healthy people, restored people, people who have been healed together. Right? A very hard process. And so I think that if you've never read this confession, I invite you to, but more importantly, if you've never read the report of a committee of people who spent 3-4 years praying together, eating together, dreaming together, mourning together, to offer us a way forward, then I also want you to do that. That we are a people who've been trying to be faithful and working at this faithfulness from the very beginning, and we have breadcrumbs all over the place that tell us and give us a way to think about these questions very differently than the ways that often in our society we talk about them.
Yeah. And I think just to say a quick word about restorative justice is that as someone has learned a little bit about these processes, is that the shift, it really demands that we ask different questions, right? You know, in the United States, our model of justice so often is framed around retributive justice, right? You know, like when someone is accused of a crime, it becomes the state versus this individual, right? And the question is often asked, what law was broken? Like what rule was transgressed? And then what is the punishment that will follow as a result of that rule being broken, right? Whereas with restorative justice, the question isn't around what law was broken, but rather what relationships were damaged, right? What are the needs of those who have been harmed? Like centering those needs and then saying, and what does justice require in terms of repairing the harm, right? Like it's not just about like this, antagonistic approach, but it's really about like how we as a community all have a responsibility in seeking that repair. Yeah.
So the last of the rootedness that we think inform the work of moving from simply wanting to be good to being faithful is this business of the witness that we have from Jesus and the disciples, right? And when Ryan and I were thinking about this conversation and this little bit of time we have to share with you in the plenary, we talked about, well, we should talk about the political thing. Like we should just go ahead and name the political thing, because all too often when people hear the words racial justice, or they hear the words that anti-racism, like the work we do at Crossroads, people immediately go to a place of the politics of it, right? And meaning the partisanness of it. What can feel like the divisiveness on it, or the challenging piece to my beliefs other, or the thing about I don't want to be called place, or the I don't want to be accused place. There's so much that surfaces. And what we want to suggest is that fundamentally the work of being faithful followers of Jesus Christ, faithful responders to God's love, fundamentally that is political work. And what we mean by that is not work of one party or another, or one denomination or another, or one community group or another. Those will be kinds of party conversations. But that what we really mean is the work of struggling together with what does it mean to be a community? What does it mean to be a community where people belong to each other? What does it mean a community where people care for each other? What does it mean a community that, let me go back up. I grew up at a time where what would Jesus do was abrasive it, right? That was my deeply shaping identity statement as a young Protestant in the US. What would Jesus do? And we would walk around and we would ask, you person who is unhoused, what would Jesus do? Right? You person who is downtrodden. And we would ask ourselves those questions. That is a political ethic. To walk around asking that question is not a partisan question, it's a political question. And we would say that the way of moving from shallow goodness to deep faithfulness, to active faithfulness, is to ask ourselves some political questions, some questions of who are we? Who are we called to be? Who do I call my sibling and why? What do I do for that whom God loves deeply and why? How do I respond to God's love and why? Right? So we want to suggest that what we have from Jesus is not an apolitical witness. What we have from Jesus is a profoundly political set of teachings, inviting us into something more deeply than just being people who perform good deeds, if you will.
Yeah. And so, just within this image here, right, you see the image of Christ driving out the money changers at the temple, and just thinking about the number of times in the Gospels that Jesus is offering a critique, speaking truth to power, and the ways that that various groups were creating divisions, creating hierarchies of like who belonged, who didn't belong, and using his own ministry to really bear witness to challenging that status quo. So once again, in this one, we have another quote that we'll bring in. So if we can go to the next slide, we'll read that in. And so.
And we referenced this already today. It's one of the things I named in the sermon. I still remember the day I read this when I was moving from being a disciple to being a Presbyterian. You know, my people are non-creedal people. We no creed but Christ, no book but the Bible. And I remember the first time I sat at a Presbyterian church and they said, we are now going to confess our sins. And I was like, I am, of course, not going to do that. I am going to sit here and refuse to participate in any collective activity. That means I'm making a declaration. And it took about 10 years for me to interrupt that resistance. But I still remember the first time I heard this. And I remember there's a woman named Cynthia Campbell who was my boss at some point. And I remember Cynthia reading these words at the chapel at McCormick Seminary and being so moved, right? In a broken and fearful world, the Spirit gives us courage to pray without ceasing, to witness among all peoples to Christ as Lord and Savior, to unmask idolatries in church and culture, to hear the voices of peoples long silence, to work with others for justice, freedom, and peace. That is a political statement. That's a theological statement. That's a statement of a people seeking to be faithful. That's not a statement of people trying to be good. It's a statement of people trying to be faithful disciples, responding to their baptism. And so I think that for us, when we think about the work that we do, we certainly understand that the work that we do at times can be controversial. And yet for us, certainly for me as a person of faith and how I approach my work, is that I believe our work is to assist people, to partner with people, to come alongside people as they're trying to grapple with the hard questions of what it means to be people who are being and witnessing what it means to belong to each other in a world that is very good at telling us we don't belong to each other. It's fundamentally what this work is about.
Yeah. And I think part of the tools and the frameworks that we offer for groups and individuals are really rooted in this idea of like, what does it mean to be critically self-aware? Like, how do we ask different questions? How do we go deeper? How do we get beyond just the binary of good versus bad? And so if we shift to the next slide, actually, part of how Dolly Chugh will frame this in her book is she talks about like people who are invested in kind of just this idea of goodness often get stuck in what we would describe as a fixed mindset where, you know, and think about, I think we get stuck in this all the time, right? Like I am somebody who has never been very good at skiing downhill. Don't have a lot of practice in it, living in the Midwest. Every time I downhill ski, every time I put on rollerblades or I try to go ice skating, it is a painful experience. So I would say I have a very fixed mindset about those types of activities. I have tracks in my mind that say, and again, I am not good at this. I do not enjoy this. I will never, ever be someone who does these things. Well, that ends up becoming a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Because we have a fixed mindset around it. The same can be true about I'm not a cook, I'm not artistic, I'm not a good musician, or I can't sing well, right? As opposed to a growth mindset. And if you can shift to the next slide here, I think this, you know, a fixed mindset is this idea that we have nothing to learn, that we are fully formed, right? Whereas the idea of a growth mindset really invites this idea that we do have the ability to grow. We have the capacity to change. We may be along the way in a journey, but we're not finished yet. And so this idea, so Dolly talks about this idea of, as opposed to being invested in being good people, what if we talked about the idea of being good-ish? She actually uses this language that I am someone I know I can rest confidently in my fundamental inherent worth as a human being, but I also know that I have blind spots and I have places that I need to grow. And that's leaning into a growth mindset. So we want to spend a couple minutes just thinking about what are some tips for cultivating a growth mindset. So if you can shift to the next slide here. You want to lead us off, Jessica?
Yeah. So acknowledging quote unquote blind spots that we have, right? And especially in a tradition of confession, right? Every week we go and confess. Every week we say something about the things we missed all throughout the week, the things we didn't acknowledge. And yet when we are personally confronted by the things we don't see, we become incredibly defensive. And so we want to suggest that part of what it means to do and be people who are engaged in this work of having a growth mindset and people who are committed to having inclusive community, having diversity, having people who are different than them in their lives. The part of what we have to do is to acknowledge that there are lots of things we just don't notice. All kinds of things we just don't see. And if we could think of those as micro moments of confession, then we can say, with every confession, there is grace. And with every grace, that moment of grace, there's an opportunity to do something different, right? But if I am going to resist that, then I will never get to experience neither the grace that I'm going to receive, nor the opportunity to have this like transformative experience, this learning experience that pushes me beyond my comfort zone into a place of both risk and opportunity. And so we wanna say we have to acknowledge that there are millions of things we are not even noticing. And we might as well just lean into the I did not know, ask for forgiveness, confess what we have harmed, and move on so that we can learn how to not be there again.
Yeah. I think the second point here is very much connected to the first. And this is something that I would say we at Crossroads are on a journey of ourselves, is how do we build a culture of feedback that I think so often when we are presented with feedback or offered feedback that invites us to think a little bit more critically of ourselves, that can be very threatening, that we often can respond with defensively or just shove it away. And so how do we think differently about the offering of framework as a gift? That I know in my own life that anytime that I've offered critique to people that I love and care about deeply, that oftentimes that feels really, really risky. And I've thought about times that people have been courageous enough to offer something to me about a place that I'm falling short, to just take a moment that it might feel a little painful or uncomfortable in that moment to hear that, but to reflect, wow, it took the person to actually that really shows an investment in relationship when we're willing to offer that feedback. And so I think woven within all of this is within our communities, like having open and honest conversations about how do we like to receive feedback? Like, is that a question that we ask of our teammates and our community members and our fellow committee mates? Like, if we don't understand that, right, then that can be barrier to offering that, and then understanding how we use that as a way to get better and to grow over time.
One of the things that two concepts that she introduces in this book that we find really helpful is headwinds and tailwinds. And I think I mentioned that I live in California, and so when I'm coming from California to see my parents here, I usually go to Atlanta first, and the trip to Atlanta, it's about close to 5 hours. But on the way back home, the trip is usually about an hour short, right? And that's because on the way here, I'm flying against the wind. There's a massive headwind hitting that plane and slowing us down. But on the way back, I have tailwind. And that tailwind facilitates my way there, right? And it's always shorter on the way home. It's always longer on the way back here. And what I think about that and the way that she uses this concept, it basically says some of us are walking around with lives full of tailwinds. We are being propelled through life. We are being given energy, power of the wind, pushing us. And some of us walk around with a lot of headwinds. And those headwinds are having a real impact. They're exhausting, they're tiring. And we might be showing up in a community to try and be community with each other, but some of us are showing up having spent our day fighting a headwind, battered and, skipping birds and like all kinds of things. And some of us were just like riding the wind all day long, not thinking about what that means. And so if we don't have an awareness of the power of headwinds and tailwinds, of the dynamics that are impacting our lives in very particular ways, then we might show up at a place and we might receive some feedback from someone not understanding where they're coming from, getting into a place of defensiveness, not realizing that our blind spots are actually preventing us from really understanding that the energy I'm receiving isn't just about me being a bad person or being unliked. I may be receiving the pain of a person. I may be receiving the tiredness of a person. right? There's something important about understanding how is it that we become cognizant and aware of all the ways in which the very particularities of our life prevent us from being good community, and that if I can acknowledge that, then I can grow, and if I can grow, then we can be a different kind of community together.
Yeah. And again, I think this connects to the next point here around how when we recognize those everyday privileges that we might have, just some of the identities that we don't have to think a lot about every day, that becomes an invitation to think about how do we use those privileges for good, as opposed to just pretending that they're not there, that we actually use our power in a responsible way. So, as I stand here before you, recognizing I have a lot of ordinary privileges as a cisgender, white, able-bodied male, right? There's a lot of ways that society is set up for my benefit. And I think about in the same way that, thinking about the questions of who is at the table, right? A lot of times it costs me very little to ask a critical question about, as I'm sitting around the table here, I'm noticing that all of us might be men, for example, right? Well, it will off the risk of naming that dynamic in a situation for me who is male, right? Often is much, much less than someone who's not male who has to kind of advocate for themselves, right? That oftentimes people who have minoritized identities are punished for making waves, for speaking truth to power. And I can say the exact same thing in a centered identity and be rewarded for naming the same dynamic, right? And so in that same sense, right, like we all have a series of ordinary privileges and sometimes headwinds that we have to face. So how do we care for one another to name those things so that those who are most marginalized don't have to be the ones that consistently have to advocate for themselves? Now, I think one of the things around that is we have to do that in an accountable way, because that can devolve into a type of saviorism and speaking for folks and not being in right relationship. So we have to do that in a way where we're checking in with one another and making sure that we're doing that in a way that's responsible. But that is a way that we can cultivate a growth mindset together.
And I think part of that accountability is that we don't want to be the kind of people that in the name of wanting to be a good community end up replicating the values and the behaviors that actually break community, because that is also a perversion of it, right? That if in the name of being good, I walk around calling out Ryan all of the time in a way that actually diminishes Ryan's humanity, I am not necessarily advancing our capacity to be in growing relationship with each other. And so I think that the question of accountability here really does matter in how we do this work, that I often think of this call to love God with all of our hearts and love our neighbor as ourselves as being one of the accountability measurements. Is how I'm doing this, if how I'm engaging in this growth mindset, helping me animate that. And if it isn't being animated by that, then I need to sit down and think about then what is it animated by? Because if it's animated by a desire to be right or superior or better or more pious or whatever, then I actually need to interrogate myself some more. I'm not actually furthering the work. I'm confused. I'm trapped into being good. I think the last thing we want to say as we come to a close is that in the end, for us, the opportunity that we have, the opportunity that we are given every single day is the opportunity to, and the call we are given every single day is one, to move away from a desire to be seen as people who are good but risk nothing, to be people who are faithful and risk all the time, risk learning, risk expanding, risk growing, risk being challenged, risk being wronged, risk being called into accountability, risk being given feedback, risk having to say, I'm sorry, I did not recognize that. And that it is in that opportunity, in the living of that opportunity, that we actually get to be faithful people. And we may not be known as good people, but we will be faithful people. And I think that for us, fundamentally, the work that we do, the work that folks like the Anti-Racism Committee in this Presbytery is trying to do, is to invite people into that constant opportunity for faithfulness. Thank you very much.